Madame, if strangeness and novelty, which customarily give value to things, do not save me, I shall never get out of this stupid enterprise with honor. But it is so fantastic and appears so remote from common usage that may enable it to pass. It was a melancholy humor, and consequently a humor very hostile to my natural disposition, produced by the gloom of the solitude into which I had cast myself some years ago, that first put into my head this daydream of meddling with writing, and then, finding myself entirely destitute and void of any other matter, I presented myself for argument and subject. It is the only book in the world of its kind, a book with a wild and eccentric plan. And so there is nothing in this job worth noting but its bizarreness, for a subject so vain and mean could not have been furnished by the best workman in the world into something worthy of notice. Now, madame, having here to betray myself to the life, I would have forgotten one important feature if I had not represented the honor that I have always paid to your merits. And I wanted to say this particularly at the head of this chapter, since among your other good qualities the love you have shown your children holds one of the first ranks. Anyone who knows at what age Monsieur d'Estaiac, your husband, left you a widow, the great and honorable matches that have been offered you, as many as to any lady in France of your rank, the constancy and firmness with which you sustained for so many years and through so many thorny difficulties the burden and conduct of their affairs, which have driven you through all corners of France and still keep you besieged, the happy direction you have given them solely by your prudence and good fortune. Such a person will readily say with me that we have in our time no clearer example of maternal affection than yours. I praise God, madame, that it has been so well employed, for the good hopes that your son, Monsieur d'Estaiac, gives of himself are assurance enough that when he comes of age you will draw from him the obedience and gratitude of a very good son. But since, because of his youth, he cannot notice the supreme services that he has received from you in such great number, I want him, if these writings happen to fall into his hands some day, when I shall have neither mouth nor speech left that can say it, to receive from me in all truth this testimony, which will be attested to him even more vividly by the good results which, if it please God, he will feel, that there is not a gentleman in France who owes more to his mother than he does, and that he cannot in the future give any more certain proof of his goodness and virtue than by recognizing you for what you are. If there is any truly natural law, that is to say, any instinct that is seen universally and permanently imprinted in both the animals and ourselves, which is not beyond dispute, I may say that, in my opinion, after the care every animal has for its own preservation and the avoidance of what is harmful, the affection that the begetter has for his begotten ranks second. And because nature seems to have recommended it to us with a view to extending and advancing the successive parts of this machine of hers, it is no wonder if, turning backward, the affection of children for their fathers is not so great. Add to that this other Aristotelian consideration, that he who does good to someone loves him better than he is loved by him, and that he to whom something is owed loves better than he who owes, and that every workman loves his work better than he would be loved by it, if the work had feeling. For being is something we hold dear, and being consists in movement and action, wherefore each man in some sort exists in his work. He who does good performs a beautiful and honorable action. He who receives performs only a useful one. Now the useful is much less lovable than is the honorable. The honorable is stable and permanent, furnishing the man who has done it with a constant gratification. The useful easily escapes and is lost, and the memory of it is neither so fresh nor so sweet. Those things are dearest to us that have cost us the most, and it is more difficult to give than to take. Since it has pleased God to give us some capacity for reason, so that we should not be like the animals, slavishly subjected to the common laws, but should apply ourselves to them by judgment and voluntary liberty, we must indeed yield a little to the simple authority of nature, but not let ourselves be carried away tyrannically by her. Reason alone must guide our inclinations. I, for my part, have a taste strangely blunted to these propensities that are produced in us without the command and mediation of our judgment. For example, on this subject that I am talking about, I cannot entertain that passion which makes people hug infants that are hardly born yet, having neither movement in the soul nor recognizable shape to the body by which they can make themselves lovable. And I have not willingly suffered them to be brought up near me. A true and well-regulated affection should be born and increase with the knowledge children give us of themselves, and then, if they are worthy of it, the natural propensity going along with reason, we should cherish them with a truly paternal love, and we should likewise pass judgment on them if they are otherwise. Always submitting to reason, notwithstanding the force of nature, is very often the reverse, and most commonly we feel more excited over the stamping, the games, and infantile tricks of our children than we do later over their grown-up actions, as if we had loved them for our pastime, like monkeys, not like men. And some supply toys very liberally for their childhood, who tighten up at the slightest expenditure they need when they are of age. Indeed, it seems that the jealousy we feel at seeing them appear in the world and enjoy it when we are about to leave it makes us more stingy and tight with them. It vexes us that they are treading on our heels, as if to solicit us to leave. And if we had that to fear, then, since in the nature of things they cannot in truth either be or live except at the expense of our being and our life, we should not have meddled with being fathers. As for me, I think it is cruelty and injustice not to receive them into a share and association in our goods, and as companions in the understanding of our domestic affairs, when they are capable of it, and not to cut down and restrict our own comforts in order to provide for theirs, since we have begotten them to that end. It is an injustice that an old, broken, half-dead father should enjoy alone in a corner of his hearth possessions that would suffice for the advancement and maintenance of many children, and let them, meanwhile, for lack of means, lose their best years without making progress in public service and the knowledge of men. They are cast into the desperate plight of seeking by any means, however unjust, to provide for their need, as I have seen in my time several young men of good family so addicted to stealing that no correction could turn them from it. I know one, well connected, to whom, at the request of a brother of his, a very honorable and brave gentleman, I once spoke to this purpose. He answered me and confessed quite roundly that he had been set on this filthy path by the rigor and avarice of his father, but that now he was so accustomed to it that he could not keep out of it. And he had then just been caught stealing the rings of a lady at whose levee he had been present with many others. He made me remember the story I had heard of another gentleman, so formed and fashioned to this fine trade in the time of his youth that when he came later to be master of his estate and determined to abandon this traffic, nevertheless, if he passed by a shop where there was something he needed, he could not keep himself from stealing it, on pain of sending to pay for it later. And I have seen several so trained and schooled to this that even among their comrades they regularly stole things which they intended to return. I am a Gascon, and yet there is no vice in which I am less expert than this. I hate it a little more by temperament than I condemn it by reason. Even in desire, I take nothing away from anyone. This province is indeed a little more decried in this respect than the others of the French nation. Yet we have seen in our day at various times men of good families from other provinces in the hands of justice, convicted of many horrible robberies. I fear that this depravity must be blamed to some extent on the avarice of fathers. Someone may answer me as one lord of good understanding did one day. From hoarding his riches, he said, he expected to derive no other benefit and use than to make himself honored and sought after by his dependents. Since when age had deprived him of all other powers, he would have only this way left to maintain his authority in his family and to avoid incurring everyone's scorn and disdain. In truth, not old age alone, but every weakness, according to Aristotle, is a promoter of avarice. There is something to be said for this, but it is a medicine for a disease whose birth we should have prevented. A father is very miserable who holds his children's affection only by the need they have of his help, if that is to be called affection. He should make himself worthy of respect by his virtue and by his ability, and of love by his goodness and the kindness of his behavior. The very ashes of a rich material have their value, and we are accustomed to hold in respect and reverence the bones and relics of persons of honor. No old age can be so decrepit and rancid in a person who has passed his life in honor as not to be venerable, especially to his children, whose souls he ought to have trained to their duty by reason, not by necessity and need, nor by harshness and force. In my opinion, he is wrong who thinks that an authority by power attained is more secure than that by friendship gained. Terence. I condemn all violence in the education of a tender soul which is being trained for honor and liberty. There is a sort of servility about rigor and constraint, and I hold that what cannot be done by reason and by wisdom and tact is never done by force. I was brought up that way. They say that in my childhood I felt the rod only twice, and that very softly. I have owed the same to the children I have had. They all die on me at nurse, but Lenore, one single daughter who escaped that misfortune, is over 6 years old now, and has never been guided or punished for her childish faults. Her mother's indulgence easily concurring by anything but words, and very gentle ones. And even if my wishes should be frustrated, there are enough other causes on which to place the blame without reproaching my system, which I know to be just and natural. I should have been much more scrupulous still in this respect towards boys, who are less born to serve and of a freer condition. I should have loved to swell their hearts with ingenuousness and frankness. I have seen no other effect of whips except to make souls more cowardly or more maliciously obstinate. Do we want to be loved by our children? Do you want to take away from them the occasion for desiring our death? Though no occasion for so horrible a wish can be either just or excusable, no crime is based on reason. Livy. Let us furnish their life reasonably with what is in our power. For that purpose, we should not marry so young that our age comes to be almost confounded with theirs. For this inconvenience casts us into many great difficulties. I am referring especially to the nobility, which is a leisure class and lives, as they say, only on its private income. For with other groups, where a living must be earned, the plurality and company of children is an advantage to the household. There are so many new tools and instruments for getting rich. I married at 33 and approve the suggestion of 35, which they say is Aristotle's. Plato does not want people to marry before 30, but he is right to laugh at those who perform the works of marriage after 55, and he condemns their offspring as unworthy of nourishment and life. Thales set its truest limits. When young, he answered his mother, who was urging him to marry, that it was not yet time, and when he was getting old, that it was no longer time. We must deny that there is any appropriate time for an inappropriate action. The ancient Gauls considered it extremely reprehensible for a man under 20 to have had knowledge of a woman, and particularly recommended to the men who wanted to train for war to keep their virginity until well along in years, since courage is softened and diverted by intercourse with women. Happy in children, wed to a young wife, for exploits he had lost his predilection through fatherly and maternal affection. Tasso. Greek history observes of Icus, of Tarentum, of Chryson, of Astylas, of Diopompus, and others, that to keep their bodies strong for the races in the Olympic Games, for wrestling, and for other exercises, they denied themselves any sort of sexual act as long as their training lasted. Muley Hassan, king of Tunis, the one whom the Emperor Charles V restored to his estate, reproached the memory of his father for his frequentation of his wives, and called him slack, effeminate, maker of children. In a certain country of the Spanish Indies, they did not permit men to marry until after 40, and yet they permitted girls to do so at 10. When a gentleman is 35, it is not time for him to give place to his son who is 20. He is himself in the midst of appearing on military expeditions and in the court of his prince. He needs his resources, and should certainly share them, but not so as to forget himself for others. And such a man may justifiably use the reply that fathers have ordinarily in their mouths: I do not want to strip myself before I go to bed. But a father prostrated by years and infirmities, deprived by his weakness and lack of health of the common society of men, wrongs himself and his family by uselessly brooding over a great heap of riches. He is pretty well in shape, if he is wise, to want to strip himself for bed, not down to his shirt, but to a good warm night shirt. The remaining pomps, for which he has no more use, he should willingly present to those to whom by the order of nature they should belong. It is right that he should leave the enjoyment of these things to them, since nature deprives him of it. If he is otherwise, there is malice and envy involved without a doubt. The finest act of Emperor Charles V was this, that he was able to recognize, in imitation of certain ancients of his caliber, that reason commands us to strip ourselves when our robes become a burden and a hindrance to us, and to go to bed when our legs fail us. He resigned his possessions, his greatness, and his power to his son when he felt himself failing in the firmness and strength to conduct affairs with the glory he had acquired in them. Set free the aging horse before it is too late, lest he go stumbling broken-winded at the end. Horace. This fault of not being able to recognize oneself early and not feeling the impotence and extreme alteration that age naturally brings to both body and soul, and in my opinion equally, unless the soul receives more than half of it, has ruined the reputation of most of the world's great men. I have seen in my time and known intimately persons of great authority who, it was easy to see, had declined marvelously from their former ability, which I knew of by the reputation they had acquired for it in their better years. I could readily, for their honor, have wished them retired, living at home at their ease and unburdened with public and warlike occupations that were no longer suited to their shoulders. I was once an intimate in the house of a gentleman, a widower and very old, yet of a pretty green old age. He had several daughters to marry off and a son, old enough to appear in the world. This burdened his house with many expenses and visits of strangers, in which he took little pleasure, not only out of concern for economy, but even more because he had adopted, owing to his age, a mode of life far removed from ours. I told him one day a little boldly, as is my custom, that it would become him better to make room for us younger folk, to leave his principal house, for that was the only one he had that was well furnished and fitted out, to his son, and retire to a neighboring estate of his where no one would trouble his repose, since he could not otherwise avoid being disturbed by us in view of the situation of his children. He took my advice later and was well off for it. This is not to say that we should so obligate ourselves to our children that we can no longer retract what we give them. I, who am ready to play this role, would leave my children the enjoyment of my house and possessions, but with liberty to repent if they gave me occasion to. I would leave them the use of it because that would no longer be convenient to me, and of authority over affairs in general I would reserve for myself as much as I pleased, for I have always judged that it must be a great contentment to an old father himself to give his children a start in managing his affairs, and during his lifetime to be able to oversee their conduct, furnishing them with instruction and advice according to the experience he has of them, directing their effort to uphold the ancient honor and order of his house, and thereby finding firm ground for the hopes he may conceive of their future conduct. And for this purpose I would not avoid their company. I would observe them close up, and enjoy their fun and festivities within the limitations of my age. If I did not live among them, as I could not without spoiling their gatherings by being fretful as old men are and a slave to my infirmities, and without also doing violence to the rules and ways of living that I should then have, I should at least want to live near them in a part of my house, not the most showy, but the most comfortable, not like a dean of the church of St. Hilary at Poitiers, whom I saw some years ago, so cut off by his gloomy disagreeableness that when I entered his room it had been 22 years since he had gone one step out of it, and yet he was free and easy in all his functions except for a cold that was going down into his stomach. Hardly once a week would he permit anyone to come in to see him. He kept himself always locked up in his chamber alone, except that a servant, who only came in and went out, brought him something to eat once a day. His occupation was to walk around and read some book, for he had a certain knowledge of letters. Moreover, he was obstinately set on dying in this routine, as he did soon after. I would try by pleasant relations to foster in my children a lively and unfeigned affection and goodwill toward me, which is easily won in a well-born nature. For if they are raging beasts, such as our time produces in profusion, we must hate and shun them as such. I loathe the custom of forbidding children to use the name of father and enjoining upon them some strange address as being more respectful, as if nature had not readily provided sufficiently for our authority. We call God Almighty Father, and disdain to have our children call us that? It is also wrong and foolish to prohibit children who have come of age from being familiar with their fathers, and to prefer to maintain an austere and disdainful gravity toward them, hoping thereby to keep them in fear and obedience. For that is a very futile farce, which makes fathers annoying to their children, and, what is worse, ridiculous. They have in their hands youth and vigor, and consequently the wind and favor of the world behind them, and they receive with mockery these fierce and tyrannical looks from men who have no blood left in either heart or veins, real scarecrows in a hemp field. Even if I could make myself feared, I would much rather make myself loved. There are so many sorts of defects in old age, so much impotence. It is so liable to contempt that the best acquisition it can make is the love and affection of our family. Command and fear are no longer its weapons. I know the old man whose youth was very imperious. Now that age has come on, although he is as healthy as can be, he strikes, he bites, he swears, the most tempestuous master in France. He is eaten up by care and vigilance. All that is just a farce in which the family itself conspires. Of the storeroom, the cellar, and even of his purse, others have the best share of the enjoyment, while he holds the keys in his pouch more dearly than if they were his eyes. While he is happy over the frugality and niggardliness of his table, everybody is living it up in various corners of his house, gaming, spending, and exchanging stories about his vain anger and foresight. Everyone is on guard against him. If, by chance, some wretched servant devotes himself to him, promptly he falls under his suspicion, a trait on which old age is so prone to bite of its own accord. How many times has he boasted to me of the check he kept on his household, and the strict obedience and reverence he received from them, and how clearly he saw into his own affairs. He alone is ignorant of all things. Terence. I know no man who can bring to bear more qualities, both natural and acquired, fit to preserve mastery than he does, and yet he has fallen from authority like a child. Therefore I have chosen him from among several I know in that condition as the best example. It would be better for a scholastic dispute whether he is better off thus or otherwise. In his presence all things yield to him. They allow his authority this vain course. They never resist him. They take his word. They fear him. They give him his belly full of respect. Does he dismiss a servant? He packs his bundle. There he is gone, but only out of his presence. The steps of old age are so slow, the senses so blurred, that he will live and do his job in the same house for a year without being perceived. And when the time comes, they have letters arrive from far away, piteous, suppliant, full of promises to do better, whereby he is restored to grace. Does Monsieur take some step or send some dispatch that displeases? They suppress it. Soon afterward, forging causes enough to excuse the lack of execution or reply. No letters from outside are brought to him first. He sees only those that it seems convenient for him to know. If by accident he gets hold of one, the person on whom he relies to read his letters to him promptly finds in it whatever he chooses, and all the time they have someone asking his pardon who is really insulting him in this very letter. In fine, he seizes affairs only in an image arranged, designed, and made just as satisfactory as possible, so as not to rouse his bad humor and anger. I have seen, under different forms, plenty of long, constant domestic economies with exactly the same result. Wives always have a proclivity for disagreeing with their husbands. They seize with both hands every pretext to go contrary to them. The first excuse serves them as plenary justification. I have known one who robbed her husband wholesale in order, so she told her confessor, to give fatter alms. Just trust that pious almsgiving. No responsibility seems to them to have sufficient dignity if it comes by the husband's concession. They have to usurp it either by cunning or by insolence, and always unjustly, to give it grace and authority. As in the case I am speaking of, when they act against a poor old man and for the sake of children, then they seize this pretext and glory in making it serve their passion, and, as if they were slaves making a common cause, readily conspire against his domination and government. As for sons, grown and vigorous, they also promptly suborn, either by force or by favor, both steward and receiver and all the rest. Those who have neither wife nor son fall into this misfortune less easily, but also more cruelly and shamefully. Cato the elder used to say in his time, "So many servants, so many enemies." Consider whether, in keeping with the difference in purity between his age and ours, he did not mean to warn us that wife, son, and servant are so many enemies to us. It is well that our declining years bring with them the sweet benefits of imperceptiveness and ignorance, and the faculty for letting ourselves be deceived. If we got stirred up over this, what would become of us? Especially in this age in which the judges who have to decide our controversies are commonly partisans of the young and interested parties. In case this deception escapes my sight, at least it does not escape my sight that I am very deceivable. And will it ever be said enough how precious is a friend, and how different a thing from these civil bonds? Even the image of friendship that I see in the animals, so pure, how religiously I respect it. If others deceive me, at least I do not deceive myself, either by thinking myself capable of guarding against their deception, or by racking my brains to make myself capable. I escape from such betrayals in my own bosom, not by a restless and tumultuous curiosity, but rather by diversion and resolution. When I hear tell of someone's condition, I do not dwell on him. I promptly turn my eyes to myself to see how it is with me. Everything that affects him concerns me. His mishap warns me and rouses me in that direction. Every day and every hour we say things about another that we would more properly say about ourselves if we knew how to turn our attention inward as well as extend it outward. And many authors in this manner injure their cause, running rashly forward to meet the one they are attacking, and hurling shafts at their enemies that are suited to be hurled back at them. After the late Marshal de Montluc lost his son, in truth, a brave gentleman and one of great promise, who died on the island of Madeira, he used to stress greatly to me, among his other regrets, the sorrow and heartbreak he felt for never having opened up to him. He had lost, he said, by that habit of paternal gravity and stiffness, the comfort of appreciating his son and knowing him well, and also of declaring to him the extreme affection that he bore him and the high opinion he had of his virtue. And that poor boy, he would say, saw nothing of me but a scowling and disdainful countenance, and took with him the belief that I knew neither how to love him nor how to esteem him according to his merit. For whom was I keeping the revelation of that singular affection that I bore him in my soul? Wasn't he the one who should have had all the pleasure of it and all the gratitude? I constrained and tortured myself to maintain this vain mask, and thereby lost the pleasure of association with him, and of his good will along with it, for he could not be other than very cool toward me, having never had anything but harshness from me, or experienced any but a tyrannical bearing. I think this lament was well taken and reasonable, for as I know by too certain experience, there is no consolation so sweet in the loss of our friends as that which comes to us from the knowledge of not having forgotten to tell them anything, and of having had perfect and entire communication with them. I open myself to my family as much as I can, and very readily signify to them the state of my will and my judgment toward them, as toward everyone. I hasten to bring myself out and put myself forth. I do not want people to be mistaken about me, whether for better or for worse. Among other peculiar customs of our ancient Gauls, from what Caesar says, was this one, that children did not appear before their fathers or dare to be found in their company in public until they were beginning to bear arms, as if they meant that only then was it time for the fathers to receive their sons into their familiarity and acquaintance. I have observed still another sort of error of judgment in some fathers of my time, who are not content with depriving their children during their long lifetime of the share they naturally ought to have had in their fortunes, but afterward also leave to their wives this same authority over all their possessions and the right to dispose of them according to their fancy. And I have known one lord, one of the first officers of our crown, a man with an income of more than 50,000 crowns in prospect by right of succession, who died needy and overwhelmed with debts at over 50 years of age, while his mother, in her extreme decrepitude, was still enjoying all his property by the will of his father, who, for his part, had lived nearly 80 years. This does not seem at all reasonable to me. However, I find it of little advantage for a man whose affairs are going well to go looking for a wife who will burden him with a big dowry. There is no outside debt that brings more ruin on houses. My predecessors have generally followed this counsel to good advantage, and so have I. But those who advise us against rich wives for fear they may be less tractable and grateful are wrong to make us lose some real profit for so frivolous a conjecture. It costs an unreasonable woman no more to override one reason than another. They love themselves best wherever they are most in the wrong. Unfairness allures them, as the honor of their virtuous actions allures good women, and the richer these are, the nicer they are, as they are the more willingly and proudly chaste, because they are beautiful. It is right to leave the administration of affairs to mothers while the children are not yet of legal age to take over on their own. but the father has brought them up very badly if he cannot hope that at that age they will have more wisdom and ability than his wife, seeing the ordinary weakness of the sex. However, in truth, it would be much more contrary to nature to make mothers dependent on the discretion of their children. They should be given plentiful means to maintain themselves according to the standing of their house and their age, since necessity and indigence are much more unbecoming and hard to bear for them than for men. This should be borne by the children rather than by the mother. In general, the soundest distribution of our estate when we die seems to me the one prescribed by the custom of the country. The laws have thought about this better than we, and it is better to let them err in their choice than rashly to run the risk of erring in ours, since by a civil ordinance and independently of us it is destined to certain successors. And although we have some liberty beyond that, I hold that we need a very great and apparent cause to make us take away from anyone that which fortune has won him and to which common justice entitles him, and that it is abusing this liberty unreasonably to make it serve our frivolous and private fancies. My lot has been gracious to me in not having offered me occasions that could tempt me and divert my affection from the common and legitimate arrangement. I see some on whom it is wasted time to take long pains in doing good services. One word taken amiss wipes out the merit of 10 years. Happy the man who is there on the spot to anoint their good will at this last passage. The nearest action carries the day, not the best and most frequent services, but the most recent and present do the job. Such men play with their wills as with apples or rods, to gratify or chastise every action of those who claim an interest in them. A will is a thing of too great consequence and weight to be thus trotted out at every instant. Wise men take their stand on it once for all, having regard to reason and public observances. We take these male entails too much to heart, and we look forward to a ridiculous eternity for our names. We also weigh too heavily the vain conjectures about the future that we draw from childish minds. They might perhaps have done an injustice by displacing me from my rank for having been the most sluggish and leaden, the slowest and most reluctant in my lesson, not only of all my brothers, but of all the boys of my province, whether the lesson was in mental or bodily exercise. It is folly to make extraordinary selections on the faith of these divinations in which we are so often deceived. If one may violate this rule and correct the destinies in the choice they have made of our heirs, it is somewhat more reasonable to do so on grounds of some remarkable and enormous physical deformity, a constant, irremediable defect, and, according to us who greatly esteem beauty, a very harmful one. The amusing dialogue between Plato's lawgiver and his fellow citizens will do honor to this passage. What, say they, feeling the end approaching, may we not dispose of what is ours to whom we please? Ye gods, what cruelty that it should not be lawful for us, according as our people have served us in our illnesses, in our old age, in our affairs, to give them more or less according to our fancies. To which the lawgiver replies in this manner: My friends, who no doubt have soon to die, it is hard both for you to know yourselves and for you to know what is yours, according to the Delphic inscription. I, who make the laws, hold that neither are you your own, nor is what you enjoy your own. Both your goods and yourselves belong to your family, past as well as future. But even more, do both your family and your goods belong to the public. Wherefore, if some flatterer in your old age or in your illness or some passion solicits you at a bad time to make an unjust will, I will guard you against it. But having regard to both the general interest of the city and that of your family, I shall establish laws and make it felt, as is reasonable, that the private interest must yield to the public interest. Go your way, then, peacefully, and with good will where human necessity calls you. It is for me, who do not regard one thing more than the other, who, as much as I can, look after the general interest, to take care of what you leave. To return to my subject, it seems to me, I know not why, that no kind of mastery is due to women over men except the maternal and natural, unless it is for the punishment of those who, by some feverish humor, have voluntarily submitted themselves to them. But that does not concern old women, of whom we are speaking here. It is the reasonableness of this consideration that has made us create and so readily give force to this law, which no one has ever seen, that deprives women of the succession to our crown, and there is hardly a sovereignty in the world where it is not alleged, as it is here, by some appearance of reason that gives it authority. But fortune has given it more credit in certain places than in others. It is dangerous to leave the disposal of our succession to women's judgment, according to the choice they will make among the children, which is at all times unfair and capricious. For that disordered appetite and sick taste that they have at the time of their pregnancies, they have in their soul at all times. We commonly see them devote themselves to the weakest and most ill-favored, or to those, if they have any, who are still hanging about their necks. For not having enough force of reason to choose and embrace what deserves it, they most readily let themselves be carried away where the impressions of nature stand most alone, like the animals who have no knowledge of their young except while they cling to their dugs. Moreover, it is easy to see by experience that this natural affection, to which we give so much authority, has very weak roots. Every day we take their own children out of the arms of mothers and make them take charge of ours for a very slight profit. We make them abandon their own to some wretched nurse to whom we do not want to entrust our own, or to some goat, forbidding them not only to give them suck, whatever danger they may thereby incur, but even to take any care of them, that they may be entirely employed in the service of ours. And we see in most of them a bastard affection, soon engendered by habit, more vehement than the natural, and a greater solicitude for the preservation of the borrowed children than for their own. And what I said about goats, I said because it is ordinary around where I live to see village women, when they cannot feed their children from their breasts, call goats to their aid. And I have at this moment 2 lackeys who never sucked woman's milk for more than a week. These goats are promptly trained to come and suckle these little children. They recognize their voices when they call out and come running. If any other than their nursling is presented to them, they refuse it, and the child does the same with another goat. I saw one the other day whose goat they took away because his father had only borrowed her from a neighbor of his. He never could take to that other that they presented to him, and doubtless died of hunger. Animals alter and corrupt their natural affections as easily as we. Herodotus relates a certain district of Libya that intercourse with women is promiscuous, but that the child when he has the strength to walk, finds to be his father the one toward whom, in the crowd, natural inclination bears his first steps. I believe that this must lead to frequent mistakes. Now, when we consider the simple reason for loving our children, that we begot them, wherefore we call them our other selves, it seems to me that there is indeed another production proceeding from us that is no less commendable. For what we engender by the soul, the children of our mind, of our heart, and our ability, are produced by a nobler part than the body and are more our own. We are father and mother both in this generation. These cost us a lot more and bring us more honor if they have any good in them. For the worth of our other children is much more theirs than ours. The share we have in it is very slight, but of these all the beauty, all the grace and value is ours. Thus they represent and report us much more to the life than the others. Plato adds that these are immortal children who immortalize their fathers and even deify them, as with Lycurgus, Solon, and Minos. Now, since the histories are full of examples of that common affection of fathers toward their children, it seemed to me not inappropriate to pick out also some of this other kind. Heliodorus, that good bishop of Tricca, preferred to lose the dignity, the profit, and the piety of so venerable a prelacy rather than lose his daughter. A daughter who still lives on, very nice, but for all that perhaps a little too curiously and loosely tricked out, and in too amorous a fashion for the daughter of a churchman and a priest. There was one Labienus in Rome, a person of great worth and authority, and, among other qualities, excelling in every sort of literature. He was, I believe, the son of that great Labienus, the first of the captains who were under Caesar in the Gallic War, and who later, after throwing himself to the great Pompey's side, maintained himself there so valorously until Caesar defeated him in Spain. The virtue of this Labienus aroused many people's envy, and, as seems likely, the courtiers and favorites of the emperors of his time opposed him for his independence and for the feelings against tyranny which he had from his father, which he still retained, and with which we may believe he had colored his books and writings. His adversaries prosecuted him before the magistrate in Rome and succeeded in having several of his published works condemned to be burned. It was with him that this new sort of penalty began, which was later continued in Rome against many others, of punishing by death even writings and studies. There was not enough means and matter for cruelty unless we brought in the things which nature has exempted from all feeling and all suffering, such as reputation and the inventions of our mind, and unless we communicated corporal punishments to the teachings and monuments of the Muses. Now, Labienus could not endure this loss, nor survive that dear progeny of his. He had himself taken and shut up alive in the tomb of his ancestors, where he contrived to kill and bury himself at the same time. It is hard to show any more vehement paternal affection than that. Cassius Severus, a very eloquent man and his intimate friend, seeing his books burning, cried out that by the same sentence they should have condemned him to be burned alive with them, for he carried and preserved in his memory what they contained. A like fate befell Gruntius Cordas, accused of having praised Brutus and Cassius in his books. That vile, servile, and corrupt senate, worthy of a worse master than Tiberius, condemned his writings to the fire. he was content to keep them company in their death and killed himself by abstaining from food. In the last moments of the good Lucan's life, after he was condemned by that scoundrel Nero, when most of his blood had already flowed out through the veins of his arms, which he had had his doctor cut open so as to die, and when the cold had seized on his extremities and was beginning to approach his vital parts, the last thing he had in his memory was some of the verses of his book on the battle of Pharsalia, which he recited, and he died with those last words in his mouth. What was that but a tender and parental leave he was taking of his children, representing the farewells and close embraces that we give to ours when we die, and an effect of that natural inclination that recalls to our memory in this extremity the things we have held dearest during our life. Do you think that Epicurus, who, while dying in torment, as he says, from the utmost pains of colic, had all his consolation in the beauty of the doctrine he was leaving to the world, would have received as much contentment from a number of well-born and well-brought-up children, if he had had any, as he did from the production of his rich writings, and that if he had had to choose between leaving behind a deformed and ill-born child and leaving behind a stupid and inept book, he would not rather have chosen, and not only he, but any man of like ability, to incur the former misfortune than the other. It would perhaps be impiety in St. Augustine, for example, if it were proposed to him on the one hand to bury his writings, from which our religion receives such great fruit, or else to bury his children, in case he had any, if he did not prefer to bury his children. And I do not know whether I would not like much better to have produced one perfectly formed child by intercourse with the Muses than by intercourse with my wife. To this child, such as it is, what I give purely and irrecoverably, as one gives to the children of one's body. The little good I have done for it is no longer at my disposal. It may know a good many things that I no longer know, and hold from me what I have not retained, and what, just like a stranger, I should have to borrow from it if I came to need it. If I am wiser than it, it is richer than I. There are few men devoted to poetry who would not be prouder to be the father of the Aeneid than of the handsomest boy in Rome, and who would not more easily suffer the loss of the one than of the other. For, according to Aristotle, of all craftsmen, the poet in particular is the most in love with his own work. It is hard to believe that Epaminondas, who boasted of leaving as his entire posterity daughters who would one day do their father honor, these were the two noble victories he had won over the Lacedaemonians, would willingly have consented to exchange these for the most gorgeous daughters of all Greece, or that Alexander and Caesar ever wanted to be deprived of the grandeur of their glorious deeds of war for the satisfaction of having children and heirs, however perfect and accomplished they might be. Indeed, I very much doubt that Phidias or any other excellent sculptor would be so pleased with the preservation and long life of his natural children as with that of an excellent statue that his long labor and study had brought to artistic perfection. And as for those vicious and frenzied passions which have sometimes inflamed fathers with love for their daughters, or mothers for their sons, the like even of these are found in this other sort of parenthood. Witness what they tell of Pygmalion, who, after building a statue of a woman of singular beauty, became so madly and frantically smitten with love of this work that the gods, for the sake of his passion, had to bring it to life for him. Its hardness gone, the ivory softens, yields beneath his fingers. Ovid.